September 1944, somewhere above Nazi-occupied Europe, a B-17 flying fortress struggles through the sky, with most of its tail ripped away. Smoke pours from its shattered fuselage. The crew shouldn't still be alive, yet somehow, the bomber keeps flying. What happened aboard this aircraft would become one of the most extraordinary survival stories of World War II. Before we uncover how the impossible became reality, let us know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these true stories travel. Now, let's step back to the mission that changed everything. Before dawn, the airfield was already alive. Ground crews hurried between rows of B-17 flying fortresses, their boots crunching across the frozen tarmac. Engines coughed to life one after another, sending thick clouds of smoke into the cold morning air. Mechanics made final checks while armorers loaded thousands of rounds of ammunition. Every man on the base knew today's mission would be dangerous. They just didn't know how dangerous. Among the aircraft waiting on the runway was a B-17F called All-American. Her olive-green fuselage carried the scars of previous missions. Fresh patches of aluminum covered old bullet holes, silent reminders that every flight over occupied Europe came with a price. Inside the cockpit, Captain Kendrick Bragg adjusted his gloves and studied the weather reports one last time. Around him, 9 other crew members prepared for another journey into enemy territory. Most were in their early 20s. Some had never held a real job before the war. Now they were responsible for keeping a 30-ton bomber, and each other, alive. As the engines reached full power, the aircraft began rolling toward the runway. One after another, dozens of flying fortresses lifted into the pale winter sky. Within an hour, hundreds of bombers had formed into massive combat boxes stretching for miles. Above them, escort fighters weaved through the formation, scanning the horizon for enemy aircraft. Their target lay deep inside occupied Europe. German factories were producing aircraft, engines, and ammunition at an astonishing rate. Every successful bombing mission slowed that production, but reaching those factories meant flying straight into one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world. Everyone aboard understood the risks. German radar had already detected the incoming formation. Across northern Europe, air raid sirens echoed through Luftwaffe airfields. Pilots sprinted toward waiting fighters while anti-aircraft batteries prepared their guns. Within minutes, hundreds of shells would fill the sky. Inside All-American, conversation became scarce. Each crew member settled into his position. The navigator checked their course. The bombardier reviewed target coordinates. Waist gunners loaded fresh ammunition belts. The ball turret gunner climbed into the cramped steel sphere beneath the aircraft, knowing he would spend the next several hours suspended thousands of feet above the ground with almost no room to move. Outside, the temperature had fallen below minus 40 degrees. Inside the bomber, oxygen masks muffled every word. The only constant sound was the steady rhythm of 4 Wright Cyclone engines carrying them deeper into hostile territory. For a while, everything went according to plan. The formation held together. The sky remained clear. Even the radio stayed unusually quiet, but experienced crews knew better than to relax. The most dangerous part of the mission hadn't begun yet. Far ahead, hidden beyond the clouds, German fighters were already climbing to meet them. And within the next few minutes, All-American would face a moment that no one aboard would ever forget. The formation had almost reached its target when the first black bursts appeared ahead. At first, they looked harmless, small clouds of smoke hanging motionless in the blue sky. Then another appeared. Within seconds, the entire formation was flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. The explosions grew closer. Each blast sent violent shockwaves through the bombers, rattling metal panels and shaking the crews in their seats. Fragments of steel sliced through the air at incredible speed. One direct hit could tear a wing apart or ignite a fuel tank. Captain Kendrick Bragg kept his hands steady on the controls. Hold the formation. That was easier said than done. Flying a B-17 wasn't difficult on a calm day. Holding a perfect position while explosions erupted all around you was something else entirely. Every aircraft depended on the others. The tight formation allowed dozens of machine guns to overlap their fields of fire, making it far more dangerous for enemy fighters to attack. Breaking formation could be fatal. The bomb run lasted only a few minutes. But for the men aboard All-American, it felt much longer. Then came the order everyone had been waiting for. Bombs away. The aircraft suddenly felt lighter as its payload disappeared below. Bragg gently banked left, beginning the long journey home. The crew exchanged quick glances. Some even allowed themselves a quiet smile. The worst seemed to be over. They were wrong. Far above the formation, Luftwaffe fighters were already diving through the sunlight. The radio came alive. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. Every gunner snapped into action. The sky filled with fast-moving specks growing larger every second. Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Wave after wave raced toward the bombers. The first attack came head-on. Closing speeds exceeded 500 miles per hour, leaving both sides only moments to react. Machine guns erupted across the formation. Bright streams of tracer rounds crossed the sky in every direction. The noise inside All-American became deafening. Then one German fighter did something completely unexpected. Instead of breaking away after firing, the Bf-109 kept coming, straight toward them. For a split second, Captain Bragg thought the pilot would pull up. He didn't. The fighter slammed into the right side of the bomber with tremendous force. Metal screamed. The entire aircraft lurched violently. Crew members were thrown against their harnesses as pieces of aluminum exploded into the freezing air. For a terrifying moment, no one knew whether the bomber was still flying. The tail section shuddered. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. The smell of fuel filled the cockpit. Bragg gripped the controls, waiting for the aircraft to enter a fatal spin. It never did. Against every law of probability, All-American was still in the air. But when the crew looked behind them, they couldn't believe what they saw. Nearly the entire tail had been torn apart. The only thing keeping it attached was a tangled web of twisted aluminum and control cables. If even one of those cables snapped, the bomber and everyone aboard would fall from the sky. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The collision had happened so fast that the crew could barely process it. The cockpit was filled with warning lights, the smell of fuel, and the constant vibration of an aircraft that should no longer have been flying. Captain Kendrick Bragg forced himself to focus. He moved the control yoke gently to the left. The bomber responded. He eased it back to the right. Again, it answered. Somehow, they still had control. But survival was far from guaranteed. The impact had ripped away most of the left horizontal stabilizer and nearly all of the vertical tail. Jagged pieces of aluminum flapped violently in the freezing wind, held together by little more than damaged support beams and a handful of control cables. One sharp movement could tear everything apart. Bragg spoke calmly over the intercom. Nobody move unless you have to. The order wasn't about discipline. Every unnecessary shift in weight could place additional stress on the crippled airframe. The crew remained perfectly still, each man silently wondering whether the next vibration would be their last. Behind them, another danger was approaching. German fighters circled the formation, searching for easy targets. A damaged bomber usually meant another confirmed victory. But as enemy pilots closed in, something unexpected happened. They hesitated. From a distance, All-American looked as though it was already falling apart. Pieces of its tail fluttered in the slipstream, and the aircraft struggled to maintain formation. Yet it kept flying. Several German pilots reportedly passed close enough to see the unbelievable damage before breaking away. Perhaps they assumed the bomber would crash on its own. Perhaps they simply couldn't believe it was still airborne. Whatever the reason, All-American was given something every crew desperately needed. Time. Inside the cockpit, Bragg reduced speed slightly, trying to minimize the strain on the shattered tail. Every minute felt like an hour. The crew constantly checked for new damage. Hydraulic pressure, fuel flow, engine temperatures, control response. Everything had to remain balanced. No one knew how much longer the battered flying fortress could stay together. At last, the Mediterranean coastline appeared on the horizon. Friendly territory. The tension inside the aircraft eased, but only slightly. Getting home was one thing. Landing was another. Normally, a B-17 descended gradually, with careful control of speed and attitude. This aircraft no longer had that luxury. The damaged tail could fail during the approach. If it collapsed just before touchdown, the bomber would likely cartwheel across the runway. Bragg had one chance. As the runway came into view, emergency vehicles lined both sides of the airfield. Fire crews waited with engines running. Medical teams stood ready. Everyone watching expected the bomber to break apart before reaching the ground. Bragg lowered the landing gear. A deep mechanical sound echoed through the aircraft. The crew held their breath. The wheels locked into place. Now there was only one thing left to do. Bring all American home. The bomber crossed the runway threshold. The nose remained perfectly steady. Seconds later, the main wheels touched the ground. The landing was firm, but controlled. The battered aircraft rolled forward, slowing with every passing second. Then, at last, it stopped. Silence filled the cockpit. Against every expectation, every calculation, and every prediction, All American had survived. As the engines finally shut down, an eerie silence settled over the airfield. For several moments, nobody moved. The crew simply sat where they were, trying to understand what had just happened. Mechanics, engineers, and ground crews rushed toward the aircraft. At first, many thought the reports had been exaggerated. But the closer they got, the more unbelievable the scene became. The entire rear section of All American looked as though it had been torn away. Nearly all of the vertical stabilizer was gone. Most of the left horizontal stabilizer had disappeared. The aircraft's skin was shredded, twisted, and covered in hundreds of bullet holes and shell fragments. Jagged sheets of aluminum hung loosely from the fuselage, moving gently in the wind. Then they noticed something even more astonishing. The tail wasn't really attached anymore. It had remained connected by only a small section of damaged structure and a handful of control cables. Those cables had continued carrying every movement from the cockpit to the elevators and rudder throughout the entire flight. If even one of them had snapped during the journey home, the bomber would almost certainly have become uncontrollable. The engineers stood in disbelief. Many later admitted they could hardly understand how the aircraft had remained in one. Photographs of All American spread quickly through Allied air bases. Pilots studied them. Mechanics examined every detail. The damaged flying fortress became living proof of why the B-17 had earned its legendary reputation for toughness. It wasn't just another bomber anymore. It was a symbol of determination, engineering, and the courage of the men who flew it. For Captain Kendrick Bragg and his crew, however, the mission wasn't about making history. It was about making it home. Like thousands of other airmen during World War II, they climbed into their aircraft knowing there was no guarantee they would ever see another sunrise. Every mission carried enormous risk, yet they continued flying because they believed the outcome of the war depended on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The story of All American reminds us that history isn't only shaped by famous generals or massive battles. Sometimes, it's defined by 10 young men refusing to give up when every reason to survive had already disappeared. More than 80 years later, the photographs of that shattered bomber continue to amaze aviation experts around the world. Museum visitors still stop and stare at the images, asking the same question that engineers asked in 1943. How did it stay in the air? The answer lies somewhere between remarkable engineering, exceptional flying skill, and perhaps a measure of luck that can never be fully explained. But maybe that's why this story has endured for generations. Because it represents something greater than one aircraft. It represents resilience in the face of impossible odds. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to keep going when fear tells you to stop. Long after the engines fell silent, All American continued to inspire pilots, historians, and aviation enthusiasts across the world. Its scarred airframe became more than a wartime relic. It became one of the greatest symbols of survival in aviation history. And even today, whenever people speak about the toughest aircraft ever built, one battered flying fortress is almost always part of the conversation. The B-17 that should have fallen from the sky was the one that refused to die. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Victrix Hub for more cinematic documentaries exploring the true stories, legendary battles, and remarkable people that shaped military history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next mission.